Good morning. Thanks to all of you for joining us on this cold winter morning. We have a very special service for you today. We're going to be having 8 of our congregants join us for this special service, so I think you're going to be impressed and amazed. Welcome to this congregation where we seek to foster community, to grow our spirits, to serve others, and to work for justice. We're glad that you've joined us this morning in our sacred cyberspace and hope you will experience love, acceptance, and inspiration. After the service, please join us for our Zoom coffee hour. Our guest speaker this morning is Dr. William Mottolese. Dr. Mottolese is the chair of the English department at Sacred Heart Greenwich in Connecticut and has taught at Fordham University and St. Joseph's College in Indiana. Bill is a leader in his men's spirituality group at his parish and a Catholic contemplative group in his diocese. At Sacred Heart, Bill is actively involved in school retreats and social justice issues and teaches a senior capstone course that explores deep philosophical and spiritual questions through the study of literature, theology, philosophy, and science. Today we'll be journeying with Dr. King. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. articulated a nonviolent philosophy based on the teachings of Jesus the Christ and Mohandas Gandhi. His letter from Birmingham Jail is a complex and beautiful text that is not just about nonviolence. It also unambiguously defines justice, diagnoses the passivity of the mainstream church, and advocates confronting institutional evil through direct action. Dr. Mottolese will talk about his own journey in coming to better know the legacy of Dr. King. 4 years ago, Bill started a letter from Birmingham Jail reading group in his parish in Norwalk, Connecticut. The group meets once a month and reads the letter out loud, communally, prayerfully, and in the spirit of resistance. Bill will talk about the role that Dr. King's letter has played in his own faith journey and his life as a contemplative, activist, and educator. And now, let us enter into worship together. Our beloved musician, Wisnia, will perform the Prelude, a song by Sam Cooke.
I was born by the river in a little tent. Just like the river, I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change is gonna come. Oh yes it will. It's been too hard living, and I'm afraid to die, 'cause I don't know what's out there beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change is gonna come. Oh yes it will. See, I go to my brother and I say, brother, help me please. But he winds up back down on my knees. There've been times when I thought I wouldn't last for long, but now I think I'm able to carry on. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change is gonna come. Oh yes it will. See, I go to my brother and I say, brother, help me please. But he winds up knocking me back down on my knees. There were times when I thought I wouldn't last for long. Now I know I'm able to carry on. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change is gonna come. A change is gonna come. A change is gonna come. Oh, yes, it will.
Thank you, Avi. That was a great choice. Our chalice will be lit this morning by Sherry Christenberry. By the light of this chalice, we prepare for the future. We prepare ourselves for the times of triumph and times of trial that might come. We prepare ourselves to be present to one another with loving hearts, even in the most difficult of times. We prepare ourselves to make the connections that will lift us out of isolation and prepare the path of justice and equality. Our opening words this morning are from Parker Palmer. To suffer with another person does not mean to drown oneself in the other's suffering. To suffer with another person means to be there in whatever way possible, to share the circumstances of the other's life as much as one can, not to add to the world's pool of suffering, but to gain intimate understanding of what the other requires. Our beloved director of religious exploration, Angela Connon, will share a special message for all ages.
Thanks, Gil. Good morning, everybody. I'm here with you live today, and I wanted to check in about this past week, and I have a special story for us today. So the past week, we saw some terrible events unfold in DC, and the impact of those events have extended into each day since. It has many, if not all of us, stressed out, on edge, feeling uncertain about what else there may be to come. The scariest part of terrible events a lot of the time is the not knowing. Maybe confusing thoughts and feelings are happening, or maybe we feel scared not knowing what else might happen, or perhaps overwhelmed because we don't know what we can do to make things better. Those are all really normal ways to be feeling, and you might even be feeling all of those things and more at the same time. There are a few things I do in times like this to help me feel a little better, and I wanted to share them with you in hopes that they can help you too. First, I try to remember that all of us need time and space to process and feel our feelings, and that might mean we need space or time alone, and that's okay. Reassurance that we're safe is helpful for everyone. What makes you feel safe? Connecting with people I care about always helps me. A hug or a snuggle, a phone call, even a text or an email can connect us. I also remind myself that it's okay to not know the answer to everything, and it's healthy for us all to see each other trying to figure things out. And lastly, I like to remember that whenever something bad happens, there are many, many more good people trying to make the world a better place than there are bad guys trying to cause harm. Those good people, they're citizens who help one another and understand that we live on a planet with other people. Good citizens are everywhere, and they can do lots of different things to help their neighbors and their communities, our world be a better, kinder, safer place. How do they do that? How do we do that? Well, that's what our story today is about. What can a citizen do? And I'm going to just share my screen if I can. Gil, are you able to let me share my screen for our story?
Sure.
Thanks.
We're going to make you a co-host. That would make things easier.
Okay. Aha. Here we go. What can a citizen do? What in the world can a citizen do? Who can a citizen be? A citizen is just like you. A citizen can plant a tree. A citizen can help a neighbor. A citizen can join a cause. A citizen can write a letter. A citizen can help change laws. We didn't like the trumpets, but now the trumpets are okay. A citizen can right a wrong. A citizen can turn things round. A citizen can get things right that have been upside down. A citizen should be engaged. A citizen should care and care. A citizen should build things, save things. A citizen can be a bear. I don't know if that part is true. Yes, a citizen can be a bear. A citizen can be a kid. A citizen can wear pink pants. A citizen cannot stay hid. A citizen's not what you are. A citizen is what you do. A citizen cannot forget the world is more than you. We're part of a society, one full of joy and pain, a land of latticed people, none of us the same. And if we help just help one lonely soul, we open doors, we bring in light, we bind us and make us whole. So forget yourself for a second. Grab a shovel or a pen. Don't you dare doubt that you can. Everything makes an impact on a bigger big than you. And it all starts with the question, what can a citizen do? And that's the end of our story. I hope you liked it. Thank you for being here with us. Love and miss you all.
Thank you, Angela. That was a very heartfelt and timely message and a great story. Avi will now perform our musical interlude, hymn number 169, We Shall Overcome.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome someday. shall live in peace someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall live in peace someday.
Thank you, Avi. That was very inspirational. For our reading this morning, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. William Mottolese.
Thanks, Gil. I'm honored to be here. For our reading this morning, I'm going to share with you a paragraph from the letter from Birmingham Jail that we will not be sharing in the sermon a little bit later. It's one of my favorite paragraphs. And Dr. King talks about a word that we're hearing on the news this week quite a bit in a very pejorative light. That's the term extremist. Dr. King was called an extremist, and many of the civil rights activists, including the incredible contribution to the civil rights movement that Unitarians made, like James Reed, who were called extremists. So I'm going to read this paragraph for you from Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham Jail. But though I was initially disappointed at being categorized as an extremist, as I continued to think about the matter, I gradually gained a measure of satisfaction from the label. Was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Was not Paul an extremist for the Christian gospel? I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. Was not Martin Luther an extremist? Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise, so help me God. And John Bunyan, I will stay in jail to the end of my days before I make a butchery of my conscience. And Abraham Lincoln, this nation cannot survive half slave and half free. And Thomas Jefferson, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice? In the dramatic scene on Calvary's Hill, 3 men were crucified. We must never forget that all 3 were crucified for the same crime, the crime of extremism. 2 were extremists for immorality and thus fell below their environment. The other, Jesus Christ, was an extremist for love, truth, and goodness, and thereby rose above his environment. Perhaps the South, the nation, and the world are in need of creative extremists.
Thank you, Bill. That was very powerful. Our split plate collection for the month of January will go to AHTN, Advocates for the Homeless and Those in Need. AHTN runs a meal program for the homeless and those who might need help. Additionally, they run the Code Blue program in Lower Bucks County. For this, they go out looking for people in need of shelter during the coldest days of the year, like now. These people are provided with a warm, protected place to sleep. AHTN is very busy this time of year, and now with the pandemic, their work is made much more difficult with the necessity of wearing masks and many new rules that must be followed. Please give by clicking the link provided in Zoom chat at the end of our service, or by mailing a check to UUFLB. Please write "split plate" on your check memo line. As we start the new year, let's help others during this very tough time. Please give with your heart. Dr. Mottolese will now begin our special presentation of Dr. King's letter from Birmingham Jail.
Hi, I just want to thank the community here in the Lower Bucks County Unitarian community. I'm honored and I'm humbled to be asked to be taking part in your Sunday services, especially before Martin Luther King Day, and especially because I'm not sure I have any profound experience with the legacy of Dr. King. But I am going, I hope, to take you through something a little bit different this morning with sermon. So I want to start with a little bit of background for what we're going to do today, and talk about the process that we're going to do. We're going to read Dr. King's letter, a chunk of it, not all of it. It takes about 55 minutes to read the whole thing. So we're going to read about a 15, maybe a little bit more minute chunk. And I want to talk a little bit about where this came from and how this works. 4 years ago, this past November, I had a crazy idea. I guess that came out of a kind of sinking feeling. It was the day before the 2016 election, before the election, but I had a feeling that perhaps things could change and usher in a different atmosphere in this country, a darker one, a less tolerant one, more divisive, one less kind or more hostile to people of color, immigrants, LGBTQ people, women, the poor, etc. So I wrote to my good friend Joe O'Callahan the day before the election, and I'm going to read you exactly what I wrote for transparency's sake. I wrote, quote, "Joe, I am feeling both anxious and powerless. I'm feeling both anxious and powerless about the election and future of the country. If Donald Trump wins tomorrow, as an act of prayerful and humble resistance and love, I would like to have a vigil and read Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham Jail out loud in its entirety. For the past 48 months, we have practiced this very ritual in person and on Zoom on the last Wednesday of each month. We've had as few as 2 readers. I'd always said if nobody showed up to the reading, I'd read it myself, and as many as 20. It has been a ritual grounded in communal, prayer-like reading of this magnificent text. In the spirit of bringing some hope and inspiration in this dark winter of pandemic and insurrection, we're going to do a mini version of this reading today. So we're going to sort of set this up just like we would do on a Wednesday night. Here's how this works. We gather in a room. It was a little, like a conference table in the church, or now on Zoom. We will always start with a prayer. Usually I just sort of ask somebody and they do a few impromptu words. Ann Fisher's going to do that today. If we have new people in the reading, I do give them some background like I am giving you right now, how this works, and even some background on the letter, historical context. When we do the reading, we read it out loud, paragraph by paragraph. So we'll rotate through a group of, say, 8 or 10 readers, is roughly maybe 6 or 7 we have today. And we'll go paragraph by paragraph. So each reader will take a paragraph until we complete the letter. Some of the paragraphs are really short. Some of them are long. We're going to read one extraordinary and very long paragraph in the reading today that tends to be almost everyone's favorite paragraph in the letter from Birmingham Jail. Sherry and Gillen and Jeff have helped to organize this. Typically, if we do the full 55-minute reading, we pause for a 5-minute kind of silent reflection somewhere in the middle of the letter, which we pre-select. We will not do that today, but that we do usually hit the little prayer bowl, and we sit quietly. So let me say a few things too. Although the spirit of this event is recitational, a recent new participant in the event called it mantra-like. And it is a kind of sharing of a collective recitation that sends words out into the universe, sacred words in a sense, right? It's also an act of consciousness raising, and frankly, an act of, it was conceived in a sense as an act of resistance. So we always have just kind of opened the floor for discussion afterwards. No pre-prepared questions, people just respond to the reading of the text. Obviously, that's not something we can do today, but you can do that on your own. And maybe with your family at home. Anne, I'm going to have you give us a short prayer, just to give a sense of the order. After Anne does the prayer, I'm going to say about 3 or 4 sentences of why Dr. King wrote this letter. Many of you probably know, but I'm going to say 3 or 4 sentences, and then we'll pass it over to the moderator to start reading this piece in order. Does that sound good, Gil? Okay, good. Anne, can I turn it over to you?
Yes, good morning. And I will borrow words from Katie Kandarian Morris. Here we have come into this sacred space, quieter now with our readiness, hushed voices, hoping, trusting for so many things, for connection, for communion, for inspiration, for information, for healing, for wholeness, for words, for music, for celebration and consolation. Here we have come into this space, bringing all of who we are. Let us be willing, however we are changed. Amen.
Yeah, that was beautiful. Thank you. So a very quick historical context, and then I think, Jeff, you are the first reader, right?
Correct.
Okay, so I usually ask people who knows why Dr. King wrote this letter. I'm not going to do that. I'll give you the quick version of this. You may know this, that Dr. King was arrested. I mean, he was arrested some 75 plus times, maybe more. Someone probably knows how many. But this letter was written after being arrested for parading without a permit in the spring of 1963, in April 1963. He wrote it in response to an admonitory letter published by 7 Alabama clergymen scolding Dr. King for stirring things up, for inciting violence, for not letting the system work out the issues of the South, right? So Dr. King in jail, the word is that he started drafting it on the side of the newspaper, really wrote this extraordinarily beautiful letter, and obviously edited it and revised it, and eventually it was published in the Atlantic Monthly. So that's the context when he refers, he will address other people and be responding to some of the things that these clergymen said in the letter. So Jeff, I'm going to turn it over to the process, the reading process.
In any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps: collection of the facts to determine whether injustices exist, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. We have gone through all these steps in Birmingham. There could be no gainsaying the fact that racial injustice engulfs this community. Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. Its ugly record of brutality is widely known. Negroes have experienced grossly unjust treatment in the courts. There have been more unsolved bombings of Negro homes and churches in Birmingham than in any other city in the nation. These are the hard, brutal facts of the case. On the basis of these conditions, Negro leaders sought to negotiate with city fathers, but the latter consistently refused to engage in good faith negotiation. Rich?
Rich, you're muted.
This happens all the time, by the way. The muting.
Rich Kelly, you're muted, Rich.
Gil will read it. Gil. Here, read it now.
Right. Then, last September, came the opportunity to talk with leaders of Birmingham's economic community. In the course of the negotiations, certain promises were made by the merchants. For example, to remove the store's humiliating racial signs. On the basis of these promises, the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and the leaders of the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights agreed to a moratorium on all demonstrations. As the weeks and months went by, we realized that we were the victims of a broken promise. A few signs, briefly removed, returned, the others remained.
Can I interject one word in here before we move on? By the way, when we read this, there is one or two usages of the N word in here. I forgot to mention this. And usually we do not say the word. We say N word out of respect. I should say out of acknowledgement of the hateful history of that word. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to interject that. Let's continue.
As in so many past experiences, our hopes had been blasted, and the shadow of deep disappointment settled upon us. We had no alternative except to prepare for direct action, whereby we would present our very bodies as a means of laying our case before the conscience of the local and the national community. Mindful of the difficulties involved, we decided to undertake a process of self-purification. We began a series of workshops on nonviolence, and we repeatedly asked ourselves, are you able to accept blows without retaliating? Are you able to endure the ordeal of jail? We decided to schedule our direct action program for the Easter season, realizing that except for Christmas, this is the main shopping period of the year. Knowing that a strong economic withdrawal program would be the byproduct of direct action, we felt that this would be the best time to bring pressure to bear on the merchants for the needed change.
You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. My citing the creation of tension as part of the work of the nonviolent register may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly opposed violent tension, but there is a type of constructive, nonviolent tension which is necessary for growth. Just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, so must we see the need for nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood.
The purpose of our direct action program is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. I therefore concur with you in your call for negotiation. Too long has our beloved Southland been bogged down in a tragic effort to live in monologue rather than dialogue.
One of the basic points in your statement is that the action that I and my associates have taken in Birmingham is untimely. Some have asked, why didn't you give the new city administration time to act? The only answer that I can give to this query is that the new Birmingham administration must be prodded about as much as the outgoing one before it will act. We are sadly mistaken if we feel that the election of Albert Boutwell as mayor will bring the millennium to Birmingham. While Mr. Boutwell is a much more gentle person than Mr. Connor, they are both segregationists, dedicated to maintenance of the status quo. I have hope that Mr. Boutwell will be reasonable enough to see the futility of massive resistance to desegregation. but he will not see this without pressure from devotees of civil rights. My friends, I must say to you that we have not made a single gain in civil rights without determined, legal, and nonviolent pressure. Lamentably, it is an historical fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. Individuals may see the moral light and voluntarily give up their unjust posture. But as Reinhold Niebuhr has reminded us, groups tend to be more immoral than individuals.
We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well-timed. In the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation, for years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see, with one of our distinguished jurists, that justice too long delayed is justice denied.
We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward gaining political independence, but we still creep at horse and buggy pace toward gaining a cup of coffee at the lunch counter. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait, but when you have seen the vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your Black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness toward white people. When you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean? When you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you. When you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored. When your first name becomes N-word, your middle name becomes boy, however old you are, and your last name becomes John, and your wife and mother are never given the respected title Mrs. When you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next, and are plagued with inner fears and outer resentments. When you are forever fighting a degenerating series of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience.
Great. You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern, since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954 outlawing segregation in the public schools. At first glance, it may seem rather paradoxical for us consciously to break laws. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal, but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all.
Now, what is the difference between these two? how does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. Segregation, to use the terminology of the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, substitutes an I, it relationship for an I, thou relationship, and ends up relegating persons to the status of things. Here's
Karen, continue.
Hence, segregation is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, it is morally wrong and sinful. Paul Tillich has said that sin is separation. It is not segregation an existential expression of man's tragic separation, his awful estrangement, his terrible sinfulness. Thus, it is that I can urge men to obey the 1954 decision of the Supreme Court, for it is morally right, and I can urge them to disobey segregation ordinances, for they are morally wrong.
Let us consider a more concrete example of just and unjust laws. An unjust law is a code that a numerical or power majority group compels a minority group to obey, but does not make binding on itself. This is difference made legal. By the same token, a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow, and that is willing to follow itself. This is sameness made legal.
Let me give another explanation. A law is unjust if it is inflicted on a minority that, as a result of being denied the right to vote, had no part in enacting or devising the law. Who can say that the legislature of Alabama, which set up the state's segregation laws, was democratically elected? Throughout Alabama, all sorts of devious methods are used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters. And there are some counties in which, even though Negroes constitute a majority of the population, not a single Negro is registered. Can any law enacted under such circumstances be considered democratically structured?
Sometimes a law is just on its face and unjust in its application. For instance, I have been arrested on a charge of parading without a permit. Now, there is nothing wrong in having an ordinance which requires a permit for a parade, but such an ordinance becomes unjust when it is used to maintain segregation and to deny citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and protest.
I hope you are able to see the distinction I am trying to point out. In no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law, as would the rabid segregationist. That would lead to anarchy. One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the highest respect for law.
Of course, there is nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. It was evidenced sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar on the ground that a higher moral law was at stake. It was practiced superbly by the early Christians who were willing to face hungry lions and excruciating pain of chopping blocks rather than submit to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. To a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. In our own nation, the Boston Tea Party represented a massive act of civil disobedience.
I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal that you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection.
I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that law and order exist for the purpose of establishing justice, and that when they fail in this purpose, they become the dangerously structured dams that block the flow of social progress. I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that the present tension in the South is a necessary phase of the transition from an obnoxious negative peace in which the N-word passively accepted his unjust plight to a substantive and positive peace in which all men will respect the dignity and worth of human personality. Actually, we who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out in the open where it can be seen and dealt with, like a boil that can never be cured. So as long as it is covered up, but must be opened with all its ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light. Injustice must be exposed with all the tension its exposure creates to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion before it can be cured.
Well, thank you, everyone. That was beautifully read and very powerful in this context. Like I've said, I probably read this letter, 75 times. I've taught it for decades. When I do it with my students, we read it out loud. And so it becomes this powerful shared recitational experience that's almost prayer-like. And so every time I hear it, I want to scrap my pre-written thoughts and say other things that come to mind when I hear it again in this particular historical moment, which is quite extraordinary. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But I do want to talk with you for a few minutes, and I'm looking at the time, so I'm going to try to keep these not too long. About kind of responses and reactions to doing this letter for 4 years. And the first couple of things I want to say is that every time I read this letter, and those who read it often find something fresh and new in it. And I did this morning. It never fails to move me in powerful ways. And by the way, we read about a third of the letter. And really, you need to read the whole thing, and that's part of what I'm going to urge you to do. And I'm going to invite you to come to these Wednesday night readings if you want to join us. Jeff has been once or twice himself. I would say this for new readers of the letter, some of you maybe, or for folks who haven't read it or are reading it for the first time since college or high school. They are often moved or blown away by the scope, power, rhetorical beauty, and themes, and even more, its extraordinary relevance to today. I want to go a little bit back to 4 years. Interestingly, and I'll bring up my friend Joe O'Callahan, the first individual I emailed about doing this. He talks about starting reading this letter going, okay, yeah, we'll read the letter. I'll humor Bill. You know, this will be a good thing. I think we'll read it once. And how we kind of got hooked on it. And I kind of had this, and I thought we would try to keep reading this letter. But he talks about this, that he didn't really know what to make of this letter. And when he read it, it profoundly moved him because he realized that his first point of connection with it was these passages that we just read on nonviolence. And that he felt like in reading it, he was beginning the process of self-purification that Dr. King talks about. And that civil rights leaders like John Lewis and James Lawson have talked about how they educated themselves by self-purification. So nonviolence is a really powerful point of connection for me in this letter. But what I want to talk to you about is how once this communal process of reading this letter really kicked in, how so many other dimensions of this letter emerged. The first few months we read it, we really embraced this notion that reading it collectively was this process of letting words out into the universe, outward into the universe, words of light, right? But also pushing words or moving words inward into our hearts and minds and souls. And I think I want to give you some stories of some people's points of connection with this letter and how it moved them inwardly. And I'm going to name a few names. One of our regular readers, a gentleman named Lee Larshovic, is always drawn to Dr. King's ideas about the white moderate and how he feels he's the white moderate, a liberal guy, but living in affluent Fairfield County in southern Connecticut, and how he, quote, is more devoted to order than to justice. These are Dr. King's words, who prefers the negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to the positive peace, which is the presence of justice. Our pastor, Father David, I'm a member of I would call a more progressive Catholic parish, would come to our readings and be attracted to Dr. King's critique of the church. And I'm going to give you some of his words there. He says, so often, quote, from Dr. King's letter, the church is an arch defender of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's silent and often vocal sanction of things as they are. And then there's Anne Kropowski, who never understood her own white privilege until reading Letter from Birmingham Jail, and frankly, beginning to reflect on some of the things going on in history, not just after George Floyd, but before that as well. And a line that embodies her experience is this, Dr. King again, quote, few members of the oppressor race can understand the deep groans and passionate yearnings of the oppressed race. So what's been amazing about Letter from Birmingham Jail for me is how the letter has given me a lens for seeing our unfolding history this past half decade and very recently. And as an English teacher, I am a compulsive annotator. And I have this old ragged copy of the letter that I started with. I thought I'd show you a few pages of annotations. Every time I read it, I would mark it up like this. So I went back just in preparing this talk, kind of looking at some of the things that I put in the margin, and I kind of recorded history. So this will take you, interestingly, through the last 4 years. These are some things I wrote in the margin. Muslim ban, deportation, border practices, Joe Arpaio, Roy Moore, hashtag never again, Parkland shooting, Colin Kaepernick, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd was written in there multiple times. I also have many, many things like love, beauty, justice, etc. So I want to end here today just giving you some thoughts on this letter in the past year, the extraordinary year of 2020. I think back to a year ago, January 2020, right? What a different time. And when you do this reading every month and you're sort of the standard bearer of this reading, there's no doubt, and some of you can relate to this, no matter what you do, a kind of weariness, a peremptoriness in a sense set in. Oh, here we go. It's Wednesday night at 7:30, about a 10-hour day. I'm going to go sit and read letter from Birmingham, but I got to do this, right? And that's just an honest confession. I'd say wasn't uncommon for our group to be maybe 5 people, not many more than that, sometimes 3. But the events of 2020 reinvigorated and changed the trajectory of this letter in ways that we could have never anticipated. First, the pandemic. In March, we went to Zoom, as we all did. I wasn't sure we were going to do that with this letter. We did. I do put a posting on Facebook every month, and I have an email distribution group. But when we went to Zoom, all of a sudden our numbers jumped up from 5 to 15. And we were getting participants from all over the country and a new wave of participants. Secondly, we had, our spring, our May and June with Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery. And that changed the letter in ways that I would have never expected, as well as dozens of new people joined the reading. People looking to educate themselves. People looking to understand the systemic racism of society, their own racism, their own white privilege. And discussions took on a new power and a new energy. And my weariness has been vanquished. So the letter remains this very vibrant practice indefinitely into the future. As a man of faith, Dr. King was all about hope, consolation in the face of desolation. And my reading of the letter of Birmingham Jail over these years has absolutely fed my hope and my faith. As an existentialist, Dr. King teaches me that to be hopeful, you have to practice hope. To be loving, you have to live love. So I invite you, as I conclude, please to join us on Wednesday nights on Zoom. We can work something out through Jeff or whatever. If we can fit many, many people on the Zoom. You could start your own reading group of the letter from Birmingham Jail, but at the very least, read the letter in full. There's so much more to it. And certainly reflect on what we read today. I'm going to end with the words of Dr. King, the last lines of the letter from Birmingham Jail. He writes, "May the dark clouds of racial prejudice and the deep fog of misunderstanding be lifted from our fear-drenched communities. And in some not too distant tomorrow, may the radiant stars of love and brotherhood," and I'll add sisterhood and personhood to that, "shine over our great nation with all their scintillating beauty." And he actually ends the letter. I didn't write this in. He says, "Yours for the cause of peace and brotherhood." I'll again add sisterhood and personhood too. Martin Luther King Jr. So thank you all. I've been honored to be here. And this was a powerful experience for me. And you really read it beautifully. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks for sharing the letter with us and for helping us understand it a little better. It's so powerful, and it's just hard to believe that it was written almost half a century ago, and it's still so relevant. Mm-hmm. And hopefully you'll be able to stay after the service and talk with us a little bit.
Absolutely.
For our closing song, Avi will perform "This Little Light of Mine."
light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine. Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Building up a world, I'm gonna let it shine. Building up a world, I'm gonna let it shine. Building up a world, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
Thank you, Avi. It is time now to extinguish our chalice. The chalice is now extinguished, but its light lives on in the minds and hearts and souls of each one of you. Carry that flame with you as you leave this place and share it with those you know, with those you love, and most especially with those you have yet to meet. Our service is now concluded, but let us continue in fellowship with our coffee hour.